to begin. So I just wanted to say thank you all for being here with us for another Art at Noon program. Today's event is Cornelia Van Auken Chapin and her giant frog. And I'm Abby King, the Assistant Director of Adult Programs here at PAFA. And to start, I wanted to respectfully acknowledge that I, along with our institution and many of our attendees, are speaking with you from the ancestral lands of the Lenape people, whose presence and resilience in Pennsylvania continues to this day. So I want to take this opportunity to honor the original caretakers of this land and recognize the histories that have brought our institution and ourselves here today. I also, of course, want to thank the people that helped make this program happen. I think we even have one of our funders on the call today. The fall Art at Noon lectures are supported by the Barron family in memory of Rose Susan Hirshhorn Barron, who is a former docent at the Academy and a great supporter of its education programs. So thank you all for your continued and lasting support of this program. And before I hand things over to our amazing speaker, I want to mention a couple things. As I hope you can tell, we are recording this event and we'll be posting it later on PAFA's YouTube channel. So that link will appear in the chat momentarily. Oh, perfect, right there, like magic. So feel free to check out, this will be up later today. And then also you can check out our library of programs. They're all there. We've got several, at least 100 hours of programming available to stream at this moment. So also note that we will have time at the end for questions and thoughts. Know that we have that time reserved, but you're welcome to drop things in the chat as we go. I already appreciate the people who are posting where they're from. If you have questions that come up, resources, I know we have other scholars on the call. It's great to hear from you, but know that we'll be asking questions live at the end. I also have to mention, I also have to mention that we do have a lot of amazing things coming up. So we have our full Art at Noon lecture series is online, and we'll be dropping a link to that in a second. We also have fabulous exhibitions that you can see in person. So today we are going to be talking just a little bit about Dr. Anna O'Marley's Women in Motion exhibition. That's what was related to our talk today. And so if you're in the area or you find yourselves traveling, please come and see those in person or join us online for a future program. I also want to announce that we have a new lecture that just went up that's celebrating a new book by Judith K. Brodsky called Dismantling the Patriarchy Bit by Bit. And so this is a text that looking at how women have been at the forefront of general digital transformation and art making. So if you're interested in we're looking at women today in the past. If you want to look at women in the contemporary moment, I recommend you check that out. It's a free program. It's going to be in the next couple of weeks, and there's a link in the chat momentarily. So I'm now so proud to hand things over and introduce our speaker. Emily Ann Francisco is a first-year PhD student at the University of Delaware and is also a curatorial assistant in the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. She specializes in American sculpture, and her current research focuses on issues of gender, race, and class in the direct carving movement of the early 20th century, as well as the relationship between carving and ideas of artistic authorship in the 19th century. Emily earned an MA in art history and an MA in museum studies from Syracuse University, and a BA in art history and English with a writing concentration from Gettysburg College. So please join me in welcoming Emily today. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Abby, for that wonderful introduction. And good morning or afternoon, everyone. As Abby mentioned, my name is Emily Francisco, and I am really thrilled to be speaking with you all today. So without further ado, I will go ahead and share my screen. Alrighty. So I actually thought that I might start my talk today with the Women in Motion exhibition itself at PAFA, which I had the pleasure of visiting just last month over in Philadelphia. If you haven't seen it yet and you're in the Philly area, I highly recommend checking it out. There are some really incredible artists and artworks that are represented in the show. And some of the sculptors include artists like Beatrice Benton, Emily Bishop, Augusta Savage, and many more, which of course, for me as a sculpture person, I was very excited to see. So as Abby mentioned, in my own research, I am very interested in gender and sculpture, and especially American women sculptors. So my specialty is late 19th and early 20th century. I've done a lot of work on the 1930s and 40s, but my work in general straddles many different time periods across the history of American sculpture. So if you have visited PAFA in person, I know there are many members and returning visitors in the audience, you may have had the chance to explore the American Sculpture Study Center. And if you haven't seen this gallery, it is worth a visit. You'll actually find a number of other women sculptors in this gallery. And I mention this space because it's actually two artists who are on view here at PAFA that bring me to this talk today. And so here I'm showing you two sculptures on view in the American Sculpture Study Center. On the left, we have a work by Cornelia Van Auken Chapin titled Black Beetle. It's a cast stone work. And on the right, I'm showing you this bronze piece by an artist named Marion Sanford. And this work was roughly around the same time period in the mid-40s. And I'm mentioning these two artists together for a reason. I actually won't be talking about these two specific objects in great depth, but I just wanted to give you a sense of these artists' context within the PAFA collection. And I'm mentioning them together because Cornelia Chapin and Marion Sanford actually shared a studio, and they later lived together in Connecticut for many years. And they were often referred to in their time as companions in many press clippings that I found in the archives. And they were very likely a couple. I'll be speaking mostly about Cornelia Chapin today, but as you'll see, Marion Sanford will also enter this talk later on in important ways. So Cornelia Chapin, even if you are an art historian, you might not have heard her name before. But if you're from Philadelphia, you have probably encountered her work without even realizing it. She is the artist who made that large granite frog sculpture that's tucked in Rittenhouse Square. And just as a side note, back when the frog would have been originally installed in the park in 1940, it would have actually been the spot that's now taken by the Evelyn Taylor Price Memorial Sundial, which is by Beatrice Fenton, who I mentioned has work in the Women in Motion show. So there's a nice crossover there. And I first became interested in giant frog way back when I was a master's student at Syracuse University, and it actually became the topic of my master's thesis. But of course, after completing my master's, I just couldn't stop my research. So the project has continued well over the past 4 years. And so I'm very happy to be able to share some of this work with you all and to be sharing Chapin's story, which I think is one that I think strongly ties in with this focus on women's artistic networks in the current PAFA exhibition. So I'd like to take you back in time for a moment and set the stage. It's a rainy day in July 1941, and this large granite sculpture of a frog is being honored at a dedication ceremony. It has been installed at the 18th and Walnut Street entrance to historic Rittenhouse Square in downtown Philadelphia. Carved by the artist Cornelia Van Auken Chapin, the sculpture is titled Giant Frog and seems very whimsical. The community is very excited by the city's new acquisition of public art, and there is a lineup of numerous individuals who are all scheduled to speak during the ceremony. The artist, Cornelia Chapin, happens to be there, and someone asks her if she plans to speak at the ceremony. Chapin laughs, and she just replies, "No, I'm just the mother of the bridegroom." So I share this description and quote with you all because referring to herself as the mother of her frog sculpture was one of the many ways in which Chapin tied aspects of female identity to her professional identity. And throughout her career, she defined herself as this motherly sculptress in order to amplify her reputation. In this talk, I am going to explore the reception history of Giant Frog and its relationship to how Chapin's professional identity was constructed in the 1930s and 40s. And so just to explain, when I'm saying reception history, I'm talking about how the public would have responded to this sculpture during the time of its creation and installation in the park. Something to keep in mind, the 1930s and 40s were actually times when women sculptors flourished throughout the art world, and they were constantly talked about in the American press. And so in Chapin's career, Giant Frog would have consistently enhanced the artist's reputation from its creation to its final placement. And so when we look at this work's reception history, there are actually these two different interpretations that emerge. First of all, believe it or not, this work was originally meant as a sort of protest piece. Chapin conceived the work actually in Paris as this humorous response to female nude sculpture, which really dominated the French art world at that time. And then second, the work, once it reaches Philadelphia, it becomes viewed as this sculpture for children once it's installed in Rittenhouse Square. And Chapin actually embraced this later interpretation, which is really illustrated by that statement I quoted earlier, where she acknowledged herself as this quote unquote mother of the bridegroom. This statement would continue to shape the artist's professional image as a motherly figure. So across Giant Frog's intended and accidental meanings, this granite sculpture remained linked both to the female body and also to ideals of motherhood. Yet this sculpture was also a platform for Chapin's irreverent commentary on the art world. Through making these quips and funny comments about the frog, like that bridegroom comment, Chapin made critical yet very unassuming statements about gender. And then also, if we look closely at the way that the work was written about in newspapers and periodicals at the time, we find this tension between critics' understanding of Chapin as an artist who successfully challenged the status quo in many ways, and their idealization of her as a motherly figure. The story of Giant Frog is a useful case study regarding the gendered discourses surrounding women sculptors, especially as they navigated complex artistic and social networks. I would argue that Chapin was conscious of these stereotypes, and despite her unease in assuming these roles, she also harnessed them to her advantage. So Giant Frog was basically this mechanism through which Chapin both navigated and resisted normative assumptions about gender. But before I continue further, I want to make sure I talk a bit more about Chapin's background. She was born in 1893, and she grew up in a wealthy New York family. So as a young girl, she was privileged with private school education, frequent visits to museums, and many family trips to Europe, which all in turn cultivated her strong interest in sculpture. But actually, unlike the other women in her family, Chapin never attended college. She instead began her artistic training in the 1920s through private study in New York. And her early training was shaped by a number of women sculptors who had become her peers. Her first teacher was Gail Sherman Corbett, and then later Genevieve Carr Hamlin. Chapin was also involved with specific organizations like the National Association of Women Painters and Sculptors, also the Pen and Brush, and the Philadelphia 10, among a number of other groups. So strong networks, communities, and training under women instructors would help launch her career. And I just want to briefly mention that most of Chapin's early sculptures were these small bronze animals and figures like the ones I'm showing you here. So meanwhile, Chapin becomes very fascinated by direct carving, which was both a technique and a philosophy of sculptural practice that was popular at the time. From about 1910 to 1940, direct carving had emerged really as an international movement. And it caught the attention of sculptors and critics in not just the United States, but also in France and Great Britain. And so these two examples I'm showing you here are by the artists William Zorak and Chaim Gross. For more context, up until this moment, traditional academic sculptors rarely executed their own works, right? They would create an original wax, plaster, or clay model, which would then go to a foundry to be cast in bronze, or if it was a stonework, it would be handed to a team of assistants or artisans to carve it in stone. But direct carvers believed that the artist should be intimately involved in the work from start to finish. And there were, of course, many other influences behind direct carving at the time. And these included the arts and crafts movement, as well as primitivist fascinations with carvings from African and Oceanic cultures. And obviously, direct carving techniques involved painstakingly carving everything by hand, which is very labor intensive. So as a result, in Europe and in the US, this technique was generally perceived to be quote unquote masculine, because intense physical labor was considered to be men's work. But there were numerous women artists who also worked in this method, as you can see here in these examples. So these artists here are Selma Burke, Concetta Schiaravallione, and Bessie Stowe Collender. Women carvers who chose such a difficult approach to sculpture were considered unusually strong and resilient for their gender. So in 1934, at age 41, Chapin moves from New York to Paris, and she's seeking out Mateo Hernandez, who was a prominent Spanish sculptor, a direct carver, with whom she wanted to study. So by this point, she was already this accomplished artist. She had been exhibiting at the National Academy of Design in New York, for example, but she desired further instruction abroad, specifically in direct carving techniques. She had seen Hernandez's sculptures at a show, probably in New York, and most likely was drawn to his practice of carving animals directly from life. So a little more about Hernandez. He was one of Europe's foremost animal sculptors at the time, and he was known for working with these very hard stones like granite and diorite. And so studying with Hernandez, Hernandez instructed Chapin in this method of working directly from life, and the two sculpted in many of the zoos that surrounded Paris. So here are just two images here. I love the image of the sculpture cart in the middle of the zoo. So from here onward, Chapin would work with many different materials, including both stone and wood. And she chose each material carefully in order to bring out the natural colors and textures of her subject. So here on the left, she used volcanic rock for a bear cub, and this is now at the National Zoo here in DC. And then she used a type of Greek marble for this pelican, which I'm showing you on the right, which is now in the collection of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, formerly in the Corcoran collection, actually. But for Giant Frog, she chose granite, and she chose this type that came from the Brittany region of France, most likely because of its dark gray tone and this very speckled texture, which almost could mimic a frog's skin, and also could appear moist if the surface was highly polished or wet. So I should also point out that granite is an extremely hard stone, which showcases Chapin's skill all the more. I'm showing you here just a few different angles of the sculpture so that you can see the animal's smooth back and those sort of thin spinal ridges on the back. You can tell that all of the animal's muscles have been very carefully shaped. And about the pose, Chapin wanted to depict the frog in action at the moment just before the animal prepares to leap and jump. But in addition to the craft and ambition behind this work, the larger-than-life size of Chapin's frog challenged expectations of what a woman sculptor could accomplish. It was carved from just a single block, and this frog is really monumental in comparison to her previous stone animals, which were often the size of these small garden statuettes. But in contrast, the frog is over 3 feet high, and it weighs roughly 1,800 pounds. It's very heavy. To make a work in granite of this scale required a great deal of strength, commitment, and endurance. And as Chapin's first large-scale stone sculpture, it reflected her growing boldness as an artist. So Chapin is in Paris, and in 1937, she submits Giant Frog to the Salon d'Automne, which is a prestigious annual exhibition. Her submission was an act of rebellion. It was based on her irritation with the pervasiveness of the female nude at Parisian exhibitions. Chapin later reflected that she entered the frog in protest against the, quote, soft nudes shown so frequently in Paris, and against the, quote, numerous nude ladies that were lounging all around the Fine Arts Building, end quote. The Fine Arts Building that Chapin's referring to was most likely the Petit Palais, which hosted a Salon des Indépendants exhibition that year as part of the 1937 Exposition of Arts and Techniques, or World's Fair. Most of its galleries focused on individual artists, many of whom drew upon the female nude for inspiration, just by chance. And the examples I'm showing you on screen were all works that were shown in this particular exhibition. So when Chapin submitted the frog, what she called one of the quote unquote humblest of animals, she aimed to prove that, quote, a frog sitting in the same position had just as much dignity, if not more, than a nude sculpture. So when we first read this quote, Chapin's comment seems to question the secondary status of animal sculpture to figurative sculpture within the art world of the period. But actually, her comparison between a frog and a nude, in fact, is a pun in its French context. The French word for frog, grenouille, was a colloquial term for a woman of easy virtue or prostitute. This pun would have been particularly poignant in Paris, where the term had even inspired the naming of a popular bathing spot outside the city, La Grenouillère, or the Frog Pond. This location was a popular subject for Impressionist painters back in the 19th century, as you can see in this famous example by Monet. And its meaning would have been well embedded in Parisian culture by Chapin's time. According to Jean Renoir, who was the son of Pierre-Auguste Renoir, the name of La Grenouillère derived not from the frogs in the area, but from the quote unquote class of unattached young women who frequented the social spot. Now, it was a gathering place for the middle class, tourists, and society women, but also by the grenouille, which included both sexually promiscuous women and paid prostitutes. And notably, many of the working women who modeled for painters and sculptors in Paris at the time were also prostitutes or were considered to be sexually available. Chapin's frog, therefore, represented both a humble animal and a sexually available Parisian woman. And so with this bitingly humorous comparison, Chapin pokes fun at the artists whose work objectified female bodies, especially in light of the female nude's popularity in Parisian exhibitions. Meanwhile, in the press, French critics seemingly avoided the artist's rebellious commentary with Giant Frog. There was one critic who referred to the work as an amusing frog in granite, though they didn't specify what was so amusing about it. And the work was occasionally mentioned in reviews of the Salon d'Automne that year. The largest discussions of Chapin's work focused on her biography, and she generally received positive but still gendered criticism. For example, art critic Louis Vaucel, in the article shown here, claimed she was strong for a woman. He begins by saying, quote, "Sculpting is already a harsh profession for the muscles of a woman. What shall we say then of that practice, exhausting and difficult, which is direct carving? To attack hard substances, truly this does not seem a feminine undertaking. For this, one must have not only high courage, but a strong wrist." This passage exemplifies the widely held belief that women were physically weaker than men, which was a stereotype that women sculptors often faced. In Vaucell's view, Chapin's status as the only woman in Europe with capable strength became her selling point. But Vaucell's positive praise is coded with patriarchal assumptions. For example, he, in this article, is discussing Hernandez for a substantial part of the essay, and he credits him for Hernandez, that is, for Chapin's skill, which puts her in this patriarchal lineage that undermines her own creative development. In addition, Vaucell's praise for Chapin's strength is further undermined in some ways by the photograph of her that accompanies the essay. The caption of this photo is Miss Cornelia Chapin at work. And here the artist is standing in front of her sculpture cart in the Vincennes Zoo, specifically. A work in progress, that pelican I showed you before, sits before her. And she's holding this tool in her right hand that barely grazes the top of the marble. She's standing upright and looks directly at the camera. Her body language, in some ways, is stiff and posed. Yet, Chapin's eye contact with the viewer suggests control. She's performing her professional identity as a woman direct carver for the public eye. But the portrait, however, is strikingly different from photographs of Chapin's hands at work that the artist kept in her scrapbooks and personal papers, some of which I'm showing you on the right. These images also circulated in newspapers across the US. The fact that Chapin preserved so many of these images indicates the value she placed on the labor of her hands. And although Vaucell does mention Chapin's quote unquote vigorous hands in the article, as well as her commitment to the forceful work of direct carving, in the posed portrait, Chapin plays a sculptress who is poised but contained, holding her tool like a prop. Vaucell's text and the accompanying portrait showcase tension between Chapin's reputation for challenging norms and the author's discussion of her in these biased terms. And so this serves as a prime example of how the professional identities of women artists like Chapin were deeply constructed and responsive to the gendered criticism of popular art critics like Vaucell. So let's head to the US. In the United States, Chapin's reception would continue to be gendered, unsurprisingly. Chapin had gone back to the US periodically while she was living in Paris, but she moved back permanently to New York around 1938, just before the outbreak of World War II. And when she arrives, not long after, Giant Frog is frequently exhibited. So by the time the sculpture gets to Philadelphia, it had already been seen at the Brooklyn Museum, the 15 Gallery, and also the New York World's Fair. But after the fair, Giant Frog was in a show of Chapin's work at the Philadelphia Print Club, which of course still exists today and is now called the Print Center. It's worth mentioning here that Chapin had ties to Philadelphia through her involvement with PAFA. Although she was never a PAFA student, she did often exhibit work in the annual exhibitions. And she also had family ties to Philly through her sister Catherine, who had married the prominent Philadelphian Francis Beetle. Anyway, while Giant Frog was displayed at the Print Club, it caught the attention of the Fairmount Park Art Association, or FPAA, today known as the Association for Public Art. So for context, among other projects, the FPAA often purchased and donated artwork to the city in Chapin's time. Giant Frog was very quickly considered as a potential acquisition, and there was one board member who suggested that the frog should be placed in Rittenhouse Square. It was thought that the frog could balance Billy, the small bronze goat sculpture by Albert Leslie, who was already in the square. Young visitors, as you can see here, had often visited the goat and even climbed on it, and it was well known for delighting the local children. And so it was thought that the frog would be a similarly popular attraction for kids. After the Print Club exhibition ended, Giant Frog was temporarily displayed in Rittenhouse Square as part of the 1940 Sculpture International exhibition, and that was when it first becomes a local hit. Ultimately, the Rittenhouse Square Improvement Association raised funds from the community to help buy the sculpture permanently for the city, as the FPAA had been very concerned about the cost. The final acquisition ultimately got approved because it appealed to old and young alike, in their words, and it was dedicated at the prominent 18th and Walnut Street entrance to the park, just down the diagonal to the corner opposite from the goat. So in the span of time between Giant Frog's first installation in 1940 and its official dedication in 1941, this sculpture was consistently associated with children, and Chapin herself was portrayed as a motherly figure, as shown in these press clippings. Photographs like these circulated widely and appeared in newspapers across the states. This reveals a nationwide trend for associating Chapin and the frog with children, in spite of, or perhaps because of, the fact that she had none. The photographs often accompanied these really playful and fun articles that personified this frog as a rebellious child. And many critics or journalists called it a pop-eyed rascal who had been knocking about the country ever since it arrived. And so by this point, the frog, funny enough, was consistently referred to with male pronouns, with just a few exceptions, really. As the sculpture grew in popularity, it's interesting that the gender of Giant Frog had distinctly shifted from female to male, from this manifestation of the female nude to a playful young boy or a bridegroom. In general, American critics during this time were often very quick to interpret women's sculpture through themes like childhood and motherhood. One writer even felt that artistic subjects dealing with children were perfect for women sculptors because, in their view, as women artists, they were historically responsible for the molding of life in roles as mothers, their words. To these critics, it seemed natural for a woman artist to create a sculpture for children, an assumption that rested on seeing women as playing traditional gender roles like mothers and caregivers. It's important to note that, of course, men could produce sculpture for children too, like in the case of Leslie's goat, but men were almost never framed in the popular press as father figures. Blatant cultural sexism not only led to women artists being presented as nurturing mothers, but also dictated that women simply did not have the skill to execute monumental works. American critics commented that garden sculpture commissions were more suitable for women artists because women were, in their view, quote, temperamentally less inclined to depict abstract or heroic subjects. Now, Giant Frog, with its unconventional size, challenged the notion that women were incapable of producing large monumental sculptures. Yet, Giant Frog's public appeal in the US was rooted primarily in its association with children. Now, I would say that Chapin was aware of this stance and what it meant for her public image, as illustrated by that mother of the bridegroom comment that I keep bringing up. Giant Frog by now was no longer a stand-in for the female body, but it became a substitute for the non-existent offspring of the artist. Conscious of her growing image as a maternal figure, Chapin played along to stereotypes and playfully cast herself as the beloved sculpture's mother. She performed this role through the different posed images visible in the press, not unlike that posed portrait accompanying Vaucel's review back in Paris that I showed you before. In this clipping, Chapin is standing beside this young girl who's helping place a wreath in front of the frog. And Chapin's wearing this corsage, which in some ways visually links her to the frog with its floral wreath. And so with her corsage, Chapin matches the frog and becomes this mother of the bridegroom, as she had joked. But the body language captured in the photograph amplifies this motherly characterization. Her arm is resting behind the girl. Maybe she's helping to hold the wreath, or she's resting her arm on the girl's shoulder. The two of them are making eye contact, almost as if a bond exists between the older woman and young child. And so this gesture reads like a symbol of protection and motherhood. And this image paralleled other press responses to Chapin and her work that aimed to situate her in the context of contemporary feminine ideals. Looking beyond the reception of the frog, though, the reception of Chapin's art in general was always gendered. According to primary source literature, women occupied an ever-increasing percentage of the art world by the 1930s, and especially in sculpture, yet women artists constantly struggled for objective judgment in juried exhibitions and in the press. And as some scholars have noted, the art world of this period was almost crowded with women sculptors, which had implications for many of these artists. It's hard enough to distinguish oneself in the field, and it was even more difficult because of common stereotypes that existed about women sculptors at the time. These stereotypes, I haven't mentioned already, included things like amateurism, the perceived inability to do the necessary physical labor, and also the reliance on men or male assistants. So this is all important to keep in mind when thinking about how Chapin's work was presented and received. And during this time, Americans became familiar with women sculptors through newspaper and magazine articles, as well as through popular memoirs and books. These texts both addressed and sometimes amplified stereotypes about women sculptors, even when the testimonials came directly from the artists. And one example is by the famous sculptor Melvina Hoffman. Now, Hoffman was especially known for making public comments about women's equal strength to men in the sculpture field. But in her book, Heads and Tails, first published in 1936, I'm just showing you the title page here. She has this moment where Hoffman emphasizes her husband's supporting role in her professional travels. And she has this line where she describes her strength collapsing, which is very interesting. But beyond the memoirs and the books, there was a boom in small periodicals across the US during the early 20th century. These periodicals often published pieces specifically about women sculptors, and they've been described as somewhat like mixed bags, quote, mixed bags of biographical tidbits, art philosophy, and criticism. So critics responded to the sculptor's identity just as much, if not more, than the work itself. And most American critics evaluated women sculptors like Chapin in terms of their work's degree of femininity, or focused on her character and her personal life. There's language like domestic delicacy and feminine grace. These types of words are what would saturate reviews about women sculptors at the time. For comparison, reviews of male sculptors focused on their work's formal qualities, and they were often described in relation to ideas like control, spiritual growth, and artistic power. And so gendered criticism was more positive for men, whereas for women, the connotations were more often negative. And there's actually one critic who really didn't like Chapin's work, and she held the opinion that there was nothing, quote unquote, essentially feminine about her sculptures. And for this reason, she felt that Chapin's animals had no character or expression, in her words. And overall, journalists and popular periodicals overwhelmingly focused on Chapin's character, her personality, and where she fit into American society. And I'm showing this clipping from 1939 from Charlie Knickerbocker's column, These Fascinating Ladies. And in this particular feature, Knickerbocker writes this short list of biographical facts about Chapin. And he notes here that she was warm and sociable, didn't like housekeeping, and was, quote, definitely not the left bank or Greenwich Village type, end quote. This expression, left bank or Greenwich Village type, is referring to the groups of avant-garde women involved in the art and literary scenes who lived in the left bank area of Paris or Greenwich Village in New York, including writers like Gertrude Stein and Edna St. Vincent Millay. Women's professional and sexual liberation in both France and America in the early 20th century threatened to upheave previous social standards of masculine power and normative marriage structures. And for the US, which struggled to come to terms with increasing numbers of women in the workforce, the complex social identities of many professional women was deeply unsettling. Women who were either unmarried or homosexual challenged the American ideal of a modern woman who was married, maternal, and a professional, and also notably heterosexual. Perhaps because of this, newspapers felt the need to clarify that Chapin, a successful society woman, was not a bohemian or tied to any aspect of radical bohemian life, even though she was a modernist sculptor, remained unmarried throughout her life, and resided with fellow sculptor and companion Marion Sanford. Now, I should say it is difficult to get a clear picture of how Chapin or Sanford would have identified themselves during their lifetimes. However, we do have some clues regarding the nature of their relationship. The two shared a home in Lakeville, Connecticut, and Sanford also managed Chapin's estate after her death. We also have this letter correspondence between Sanford and a friend dated to the years after Chapin's death, which I'm showing you right here. So here in this detail, Betty Richards, who's another sculptor, is reflecting to Sanford about her own husband's death and calls it, quote, "a terrible loss to me that he is no longer alive, as it must be to you since Cornelia died. I so often thought of you and knew how you must have felt," end quote. Sanford and Chapin, they also have combined papers at the Archives of American Art, and part of those were given by Sanford in 1974. And these two artists lived together publicly and also shared a studio, so it's possible that the press was aware that both were rumored to be a couple. But Chapin's sexuality was often addressed by journalists using coded language. One columnist for Liberty magazine wrote about Chapin, quote, "Art has given this lady the arm of an Amazon, the eye of an eagle," end quote. This word choice is significant, for at this point, the term Amazon had long been associated with lesbian culture. And then we have another journalist, Walter Sopronic, who I'm showing you his clipping here. He labels Chapin and Sanford as two happy roommates who live together amiably because they both enjoy the same things, in his words. Sopronic even goes out of his way to state that in Chapin and Sanford's relationship, there were, quote, "no signs of bohemianism or temperament," end quote. It is important to note here that by the 1940s, fear of lesbianism pervaded American culture. It was perceived as a threat to dominant heterosexual ideologies and the idealized family unit. It's therefore interesting that these journalists chose to celebrate Chapin and also her relationship, which fundamentally resisted such ideologies. And furthermore, Chapin's preference for work and animals over marriage, children, and even housework continued to be perplexing to critics. Most American critics were fascinated by the way that Chapin had dedicated her life to an extremely difficult approach to sculpture. And critics frequently noted that, quote, "Chapin's work as a sculptor is her life," end quote. They also fixated on her animals, perhaps considering them her replacement for a husband or children. And one Philadelphia critic also expressed that they, quote, "had a feeling she would put animals first, people second," end quote. And although critics rarely mention her as unmarried, their rhetoric suggests that the reason Chapin never had a husband was not because she preferred women. It was because she was simply too interested in her work and her animal subjects. To reconcile Chapin's resistance to existing social norms, American critics highlighted specific elements of her persona that related most strongly to feminine ideals. They chose her warmth and sociability, which were valued qualities in mothers and wives, as well as her deep care for innocent animals, which by extension could be compared to a mother's love for her children. So to wrap up, throughout the history of Giant Frog, Chapin both adopted and resisted these conventional expectations of women in sculpture. And although her focus was animal sculpture, which was a fairly traditional genre, Chapin's relationship with Sanford and her direct carving practice did not fit neatly into preconceived expectations of women sculptors. Because of this, critics addressed her work through gendered narratives that reflected the legacy of traditional women's sculpture. In other words, art that was tied to themes of motherhood and children. Critics really celebrated Chapin's direct carving techniques, which accentuated her artistic skill and strength, but their constructed image of her was in tune with gender roles of the day. Understanding her complicated position as a woman sculptor, and also as someone who, had she lived today, may have identified as queer or lesbian, Chapin embraced and encouraged her public identity as the mother of the frog. Calling herself just the mother of the bridegroom minimized her role as the skilled artist who had carved the massive sculpture from a single block of granite. The comment also amplified her maternal image within American society. Considering her family background and her socioeconomic status, her performative role as the frog's mother allowed her to maintain this air of respectability, despite her non-normative lifestyle and career choice. But ultimately, Chapin's approach to managing her professional identity through conventional aspects of female identity all fueled her success as an artist. In the midst of Giant Frog's photo ops with American children, the work had been selected for public display and placed prominently in Rittenhouse Square. The permanent placement of Giant Frog situated her work alongside bronzes by other renowned animal sculptors in the park, such as Albert Leslie and Antoine Louis Barye, ensuring Chapin's legacy and legitimacy in the broader sculpture community. In 1940, Giant Frog was also notably the first sculpture to be added to the park in over 20 years. Chapin was aware of this acquisition's significance to her career and was well attuned to the work's popular appeal that had enabled the Rittenhouse Square Improvement Association to buy it for the city. By leaning into such popular appeal, as well as her image as a motherly sculptress, Chapin and her work were celebrated across wide audiences. Yet at the same time, Giant Frog was also a sculpture that manifested resistance, even in its final placement in Philadelphia. Although the frog's reception as a children's sculpture seemingly muted its history as a protest piece, in reality, the sculpture remained a funny contrast to figural sculpture of the period. The massive scale and weight of the granite demands its viewers' attention to a somewhat ridiculous subject, if you think about it. This is an oversized, bulky frog that is roughly the height of a small human. Chapin elevated the image of a tiny, ugly animal to the status of high art, and her frog was certainly made equal to the numerous nude ladies, even as it was displayed beyond the salons in Paris. Giant Frog was intentionally a funny sculpture, which allowed its creator to critique the art world under the auspices of humor and lightheartedness. Radical in its original message, yet family-friendly in its Philadelphia installation, you could say the frog quietly left its way into American public consciousness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was fantastic. As a person who's walked by that frog so many times without knowing any of that context in that story, it's wonderful to hear the ways like that it's connected on all these different layers.
Thank you.
I want to make sure we have a few minutes left together as a group, and so if folks have questions, to please drop them in the chat, or if you'd rather ask them, if you can raise your hand using that function on Zoom, we appreciate it. And while kind of folks gestate a little or think on the wonderful things that were just shared by Emily, I maybe wanted to kick things off connecting it back to our exhibition Women in Motion. That's a show that is really looking at all the different networks and how female artists supported one another at a time where there wasn't a lot of institutional support and there was, direct patriarchal values oppressing them. And so I wanted to ask you, I know you mentioned the relationship between Chapin and Sanford and that romantic one, but if there were any other networks that the artist was involved in that, kind of helped her in different parts of her career.
Sure. So as I quickly referenced at the beginning of my talk, Chapin was a key member of a few different groups, the big one being the National Association of Women Painters and Sculptors, for example. And I also referenced the Philadelphia 10, which is a group of painters and sculptors exhibiting in Philadelphia around that time. And Chapin actually exhibits as a guest artist with them fairly often. But something that didn't make it into my talk was something related to her earlier training. So I referenced the artist Genevieve Carr Hamlin. There are some wonderful materials at the Archives of American Art, actually these home movies, which are fully digitized and on YouTube for those interested. Chapin actually was part of this sort of small female community that lived on this sort of farm that actually I think Chapin owned and then later transferred it to Hamlin out in rural Harpersville, New York. And there are these film reels of Chapin and Hamlin and a few other women artists, going about their daily lives, as well as working on sculptures. And so that's sort of another example that comes to mind of how Chapin's in many of these networks, but she's also at least early on very invested in these ideas of female communal living, which is very interesting.
Completely, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a wonderful question from David asking about the reference of the frog. Like, do we know anything about the specific model, or in general, like how she comes up with these images? Is she working from anatomical or specimens or from live frogs?
That's a great question. So with regarding the frog, it's unclear because there's conflicting information in these different articles that come out, especially once it's unveiled in Philadelphia and it's being seen and written about really frequently in Philadelphia newspapers. And so some journalists say she had 10 live frogs in her studio. Some say she had the number is kind of murky, but in theory, yes, she was working from a live model for that frog, but we don't really know for sure whether it would have been, something in her, how that process would have worked. In her other works, so for the Pelican that I showed you, she did that one from life at I believe the Vincennes Zoo outside of Paris. So she did a lot of animal sculptures directly in zoos. So she would go with her sculpture cart, especially when working and training with Hernandez, they'd go together. And they would just, camp out at the exhibits in the gardens and, spend many hours there, watching and studying a specific animal and carve them directly from life without any preliminary studies or models. But I should mention with the frog, she did do what I believe to be one preliminary study in the form of a smaller sandstone sculpture. There's a really interesting series of pages in her papers at the Archives of American Art that describes, her steps and her process for making this small sandstone frog sculpture which she titled Panther Frog. And there are photos of it, but unfortunately, I have not been able to determine where its current location is. So I haven't seen it in person. But in this description of her working on this sandstone panther frog, she references it being she references for the big frog, I'll do this, I'll do this. So it was a learning exercise before she went to create the larger granite frog. So the fact that we have that record of her process for the smaller frog is helpful in thinking about the granite, the giant frog in granite form. But I know I've been rambling about this for a bit, but really briefly, because it's a really funny story. The bear cub that I showed you that's in the National Zoo, supposedly for that sculpture, which she also made while she was in Paris, she bought, and this is the language of the time, she bought what she refers to as a bear from the gypsies, like off the street, and she buys this bear and brings it home as a a pet, as an animal to study. I don't really quite know. And she worked on that bear sculpture from that live bear, and actually writes about how it took her over 8 months to work on, because the bear just wouldn't sit still. And so that's sort of an amusing process story behind another of her sculptures.
Amazing. I would love to be a fly on the wall for that. Yeah. So we have a question from Amy regarding one of the newspaper articles that you listed, mentioning that instead of referring to her as Miss, they used MRS, and if that was intentional or just a mistake at the time.
Yeah. So I don't know. We probably can't know the official answer to that question. I think it could be a typo, it could be an assumption on the part of the writer. I think it was very, from what I have read of this material, most of these women artists and sculptors, when they're written about, they have that abbreviation, that preceding notation before all of their names, whether it's Miss or Mrs. So it wouldn't surprise me if whoever was writing just sort of quickly made the assumption, MRS, that she was married, or that was their default abbreviation for any female name in their text. But yeah, it just sort of goes to show the different ways and assumptions that were made about women artists in the press at that point in time, and language being really important, language and text especially.
No, completely. And it dovetails with an important comment shared by Laura in the chat about the kind of fascination of the we're just roommates veil, and how that's not something that just happens in history. That's something that still happens now. And I was taken aback by like the happy roommates with lots of things in common. And
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that article still just makes me smile, because it blatantly says like, oh, there's no bohemianism here, like no signs of temperament, whatever that means. So it's quite funny.
Oh, completely. And I think really drives home like how important it is re-examining the past to find the ways that we hid these queer stories, and how that erasure can still happen today in a contemporary moment when we feel like we're exempt from that.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, with that, I wanted to thank you all so much for joining us here for another Art at Noon. I'm, for one, just and a huge thank you to Emily for taking the time and sharing your scholarship. It's fascinating to see your journey with this project, and the way it connects not only to our exhibition, but just I learned so much today. So I'll let you have the final word, but just a huge thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Well, thank you so much for having me, Abby, and thank you all so much for coming out at lunchtime on a Thursday. It's really wonderful to be speaking with you all and to have so many wonderful questions.
Yeah. Thank you all. Feel free to say goodbye on your way out. Take care. We hope to see you soon. All right. Thank you again, Emily.